Hey guys, how you doing? It's the Wolf here, and I want to shatter some illusions because some people are trying to say in story in Game of Thrones in season 8, episode 2, Arya couldn't be more than 14 years old. That's only from season 1 to season 8. Only about 2 years have passed. I'm sorry, I have to shatter that. I have to take a gigantic sledgehammer to that reality and just completely destroy that thought process. Because we have to take in relative physics, because physics pretty much works the same way in our world as it does in Westeros, and you have to look at the size of Westeros. George R. R. Martin has basically compared Westeros to the size of South America. Excuse me, I had a burp. One more, sorry. From the bottom, tippy bottom, the bottom of Dorne, the most southern point of Dorne, to the most tippy top northern point of the Wildlands. It's basically 4,400 miles long. Where we're talking pretty much somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 million square miles. Hell, just as a raven flies from Winterfell to King's Landing is like 1,500 miles, give or take about 200. I'm using estimates because I don't have an exact math, but let's pretty much for the sake of argument, it's about 1,500 miles from King's Landing to Winterfell. Hell, let's break something down. When Jon Arryn died, Robert Baratheon went from Winterfell to the Vale, and the Vale to Winterfell, and then Winterfell to home. From King's Landing to the Vale is probably about 12 to 1,300 miles. And you probably got about another 500 to 600 miles from the Vale to Winterfell, and you got about the 1,500 mile trip back to King's Landing from Winterfell. These are just average estimates from what I've heard. The size of Westeros. And you also have to remember what Bruce Bolton said about the North, and he was legitimizing Ramsay. He told him how big the North was, and it was all his as warden. From where they were standing, you go about 700 miles east, you hit Eastwatch. You turn around and go about another 600 miles west, you hit the other port, where the Citadel is. You go about 300 miles north, you'd hit the Wall. You go about another 350 miles south, you'd hit the Riverlands. Yeah, the North was basically about the size of somewhere between Brazil, Texas, and Alaska. The North was fucking huge. So, just based on the size alone of Westeros, for Robert Baratheon, King's Landing to the Vale to Winterfell and then back to King's Landing, probably took them the better half of 6 months just to make that trip on horseback at a canter, a decent walk on a horse, not like sprinting. So that trip took Robert Baratheon better part of 6 months. And then he ordered Ned to come down south to Winterfell, which that trip probably took the better part of 2 months. And we all agree Arya was probably around 12 years old at the time that Robert Baratheon showed up. Probably took Ned a few weeks, if not a month or two, to round up all his shit, get his kids all set up, and head south. Took about 2 months to get there. Ned Stark was in King's Landing before he was beheaded for probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a year. Because he'd been there probably a couple months. Catelyn Stark traveled all the way down the Winterfell to King's Landing. Got to the river runs. Grabbed Tyrion. Headed for the Vale. Was in the Vale for a while. Then was coming back and caught up with Robb Stark somewhere around the Riverlands. That trip probably took somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 months. Hell, for Robb to raise his bannermen, from the time he called in his banners to the time all those men came from all corners of the freaking North, probably took Robb better part of 6 months. Like the War of the Five Kingdoms, basically from the time Eddard Stark was beheaded to the time the Red Wedding, that was about 2 years. And it probably took him 6 months to stand up his army for Robb. Probably took him about another month to march down to the Trident. The first battle happens. Then he marches around some more. I mean, the time it took to fight that war was about 2 years. And we also have to remember something. Before Arya Stark headed down to King's Landing, the Maester had said that summer had come to an end. It was the longest summer on record that they had kept. That summer had lasted 10 years. You see, the the seasons in Westeros work a hell of a lot different than the seasons in our world. Our world, they last about 3 to 4 months. Seasons in Westeros last years. Like, winter can last anywhere from 2 to 5 years, and the fact that summer had lasted 10 years, they were possibly looking at a winter that could last 20 years. Double the amount of time. There could be kids born, grown to adulthood before they ever see summer. Like the last winter, like by the time Arya Stark heads south, Bran and Rickon had never seen a winter. The last winter that had ever come around, Arya was probably a baby to maybe verging on a 2-year-old. Sansa was probably a toddler and doesn't remember it. The only 3 of those boys who had ever seen winter in any kind of shape or form was Robb, Jon, and Theon. And their winter, longest winter they probably saw last was probably around 2 years, give or take. I mean, I'm generalizing here, I'm averaging, but y'all need to get how the passage of time and distance works. So now, let's take a look at Arya. Starts out in King's Landing, we're going to say she's about 12 years old. About 2 to 3 months trip down to King's Landing. Probably in King's Landing, better part of a year. Father gets beheaded, gets picked up by that one guy of the Night's Watch, and is going to take her up to Winterfell. They start going with Gendry. That's where they meet Gendry. Start going to Winterfell. The guy from the Night's Watch gets killed. Gendry, Hot Pie, and Arya scram. Get picked up going to Harrenhal. Harrenhal is no small distance from Winterfell. We're probably talking a good quarter of the way. So we're talking probably a good 300 to 400 miles. Closing in on 5 from Harrenhal to King's Landing. So even by horseback, we're talking a week's ride. On foot or by cart, we're probably looking on verge of 2 to 3 weeks. Arya was in Harrenhal better part of 3 months. Then she escapes, walks around for a few days, up to about a week with Gendry and Hot Pie, gets taken in by the Brotherhood Without Banners. Meets the Hound. Gets taken by the Hound. On foot, mind you. Pretty much right outside of Harrenhal. Heads for the Trident. Probably a good another 600 miles on foot. At best, they're probably doing 20 miles a day. So, yeah, we're talking better part of a month or 2. Just to get up to the Trident. Now remember, this is in the 2 years between Robb Stark standing up his banners and being killed at the Red Wedding, which Arya shows up at. So, just in that time frame alone, Arya has gone from 12 to 14. So by about the time of Red Wedding, Arya is already 14 years old. Then, the Hound decides to take her to the Riverlands, to the Tullys. Finds out the Tullys have been surrounded by the Lannister army. Turns around, heads for the fucking Vale. After the Red Wedding. You're probably looking almost a good 700-800 miles, mostly on foot. Turn around after the veil because we found out Lisa Aarons is dead. Starts hot footing it for Winterfell, probably a good 700-800 miles away. On foot! Probably gets a good quarter of the way there. Runs into Brienne of Tarth. Have their major fight. Oh my god, fucking traffic. Sorry, guys. Brienne beats the Hound. Arya leaves the Hound. Heads for a port. They're somewhere in the middle of the Vale. The closest port is through the Vale, and Arya's not going through the Vale. So she basically went around the fucking Vale to the closest port. Probably took her a better part of another month or two. So we're talking 6 months after she left the Red Wedding to possibly a year. So at this point, she's 14, closing in on 15 before she even left for Braavos. Gets to Braavos. Minimum she spent in Braavos, and this is just a generalization, she spent a minimum of a year. More than likely, she spent 2. Hell, the amount of time she spent blind was almost 9 months, according to the books, and probably according to the story. She was blind for a very long time before she got her sight back. And then she did even more training, and she also done training beforehand. You know, and then there was the infiltration to kill that woman that basically sent that one little waif that was training her and Marshall hand to hand. That other faceless girl. That infiltration to try and assassinate that woman took months. Memorizing, the woman's patterns, where she did, what she did, how she did it. Arya was on that assignment for months. So pretty much, I'm going to call it 2 years. She was probably closing in on 15 by the time she got to Braavos. By the time she left, she was probably closing in on 17. Now, she leaves Braavos, goes back to Westeros, takes a couple days. Wherever she lands, she has to get back to the Twins, to where Walder Frey is. Even if she got there on horseback, that would take her probably the better part of a month or two, depending on where she landed. Probably maybe as long as 3 to get back to the Freys. Then she has to case the Freys. Has to figure out all their patterns. Remember, Arya slays all of the Frey males and Walder Frey himself. That probably took months to set up. At this point, she's probably 17 at this point, closing in on 18. She's probably about 17 and a half by the time she kills Walder Frey. Starts heading south for King's Landing. Gets all the way to Hot Pie. Probably took her a couple of weeks from the Trident. Minimum. She was on foot, probably more like a month, considering how big Westeros is. Runs in the Hot Pie, says, hey, your brother's king in the north. You might want to turn around and go home. Turns around and goes home. Somewhere in the Riverlands. All the fucking way to Winterfell. This trip probably took her, and I don't remember her being on horse. I remember her being on foot. This trip probably took her around 6 months. On foot. From the Riverlands to Winterfell. Took her some kind of months. Minimum 3 to 6 months. And then we have all the time Arya was with Sansa waiting for Jon to come back. By the time they kill Littlefinger. This was, again, probably months. So, for the showrunners to say Arya's 18, I fully believe it. Just on the amount of distance she's had to travel from the time she left Winterfell to the time she came back, mostly on foot. Covered about 3,000 miles. She would be minimum 16 years old to pull that off from 12. Minimum 16. More than likely, as a showrunner says, yeah, she's probably 18 years old. You throw in the 2 years, and she probably spent training at the House of Black and White and her time over in Braavos. So, To wrap this all up, when the showrunners say Arya is 18 years old, it is fully believable that from the time she left Winterfell around episode 2 or 3 in season 1 to episode 2, season 8, that she's 18, fully believable. Fully believable. It's been over 6 years from that point. I fully believe it. Also, someone else I was arguing with tried to say Gendry when we first meet him is like 20 years old. No. At best, Gendry's about a year older than Joffrey. At best, a year older. He's probably around Sansa's age. Maybe a little older. Not by much, though. So, no. By the time we get to season 8, Sansa is pretty much 20, pushing 21. Gendry's around the same. Jon, he's around 24, 25 at this point. So is Daenerys. I would say minimum from the time we start Game of Thrones season 1 to the time we are now in season 8, minimum 6 years. Minimum 6 years. Because, guys, if Westeros is the size of South America, there's no way in hell we can cover the amount of distance that this show has covered in 2 years. Oh, and Eastos on the other side, especially out in the steppes or in that wasteland Daenerys was in, we're probably talking the size of Russia. So you guys have to keep distances, size, and time in mind when you're trying to say Arya is only 14 by the time she gets back to Winterfell. Bullshit. She was 14 before she left fucking Westeros to go to Braavos. She was probably 15 before she left. So, yeah. So to all those saying, oh, Arya looked too young, oh, she's too young, bullshit. Absolute bullshit. Arya is at a minimum 18 years old, possibly 19. So yeah, she's a grown-ass woman by the time we get to season 8. Minimum. So, that's me flapping my gun for 17 minutes to basically destroy this argument that Arya by the time of season 8 is only 14 years old. No goddamn way. And it is not physically possible with the amount of distance she covered on foot with the Hound alone coming out of the Hound and the guy from the man, from the Night's Watch guy just coming out of Winterfell going all the fucking way to Harrenhal, sitting there for a few months, going all the way to the Trident, all the way to the fucking Vale, going part way to Westeros. No fucking way. Countries, Westeros is just too fucking big for her to do all that on foot in less than 6 months. Impossible. Even on horseback, it would still be impossible. No horse could run that fast for that long. So, when the showrunner says Arya's about 18 years old, come on, guys. She is. Just based on the size of Westeros alone and how much ground she covered. There's no other way. And the amount of time that she spent dicking around in the House of White and Black, oh yeah, I can easily believe she's 18. Easily. I'm the Wolf. I'll catch y'all later.